I was saying that Drew Beckwith reminded me when I was the youngest speaker on one of these panels in 1987. And I think it's very important to hear the fresh perspective with less baggage. I don't think I was half as eloquent as Drew was back then, but I was heard. It reminds me how important it is to kind of listen to our younger colleagues and to get back to the old law school for a little education. I'm really privileged to try and offer a few thoughts about water banking this morning. I'm going to give you some water banking basics, illustrate 4 prominent examples of existing or proposed water banks for the Colorado River Basin, and leave you with a few concluding issues. I'm going to use what I've nicknamed the Colorado River Hydrus. In Greek mythology, a hydrus is a marsh or water serpent with 9 heads, and each of which, if cut off, grew back as 2. The Colorado River Hydrus is actually one side of a great map produced by National Geographic with a host of collaborators from the river basin. And you can grab, some of you already have, copies of that map while the supply lasts at this conference. You can also get to an interactive version of this map from the National Geographic homepage. My old-fashioned outline of the materials may save you some note-taking and gives you a short bibliography. So the basics. I'd like to recognize Larry McDonald, who will follow me on the panel and may need to correct me, as a real pioneer of water banks for the western U.S. In answering the question of what a water bank is, I can't do better than quote from his 1995 paper. Broadly speaking, a water bank is an intermediary. Like a broker, it seeks to bring together buyers and sellers. Unlike a broker, it is an institutionalized process with known procedures and some kind of public sanctions for its activities. Conceptually, the process is straightforward. A valid water use entitlement is deposited with the bank and is available for withdrawal by another subject to certain conditions, including payment, a market payment for the withdrawal. Larry also explained back in 1995, water banks can operate at very different scales, ranging from interstate to statewide to regional to local. They can be very narrowly focused or broad and inclusive. They can be permanent. They can be created only for special situations. In short, they are conceptually very flexible, capable of being designed to meet the needs and interests of those seeking their creation. So what is a water bank? What do you need it to be? There are several reasons why water banks may be an important solution for the Colorado River Basin. We've heard that supplies are becoming increasingly uncertain in the face of climate change and that we need to plan for the worst. Water allocations and administration may be becoming less certain within and between states. And large-scale augmentation may also be uncertain and expensive, although we'll hear some about that from Les later on in the panel. Clearly, more flexibility is needed to manage such uncertainties. As suggested by Larry, water banks may fit that bill because they can be scaled up or down. They can rely on existing infrastructure. Water banking also entails voluntary market mechanisms that put complex solutions closer to the ground and that rely on incentives and established water rights. So why is the Nature Conservancy interested in water banking? Because we think it's a solution that can both protect water supplies for people and keep rivers healthy, although we know there are a great many issues that must be resolved that can achieve that kind of outcome. All right, let's talk about the 4 examples, and we'll go to the hydrus here for the Arizona-Nevada groundwater bank that Pat Mulroy talked about in the keynote address. This illustration of a water bank for the lower main stem is oversimplified, and I commend Margaret LaBianca's article in my outline for the sticky details and for a good history of the water banking proposals that led up to this one and to the next one on my list. It often takes many tries to kind of get one of these water banks up and running. This bank is built on Article 2B6 of the decree in Arizona v. California, which gives the Secretary of Interior the power to reassign a portion of unused water, main stem water. In 1 year, Arizona can divert some of its unused entitlement from the lower Colorado main stem via the Central Arizona Project and store it as groundwater. You can see those arrows on the hydrus. In a later year, Arizona can forego diverting its apportionment and withdraw the stored groundwater as needed. Nevada can then withdraw from Lake Mead in that later year the amount foregone by Arizona, in addition to Nevada's apportionment. As Pat noted, this bank operates interstate, but only within a charter from the Arizona legislature and only until Arizona needs to use its full apportionment. The next example is intentionally created surplus, or ICS. The key to this water bank is the willingness of the lower basin states to forbear a strict interpretation of several provisions of the decree in Arizona v. California, so that voluntarily reducing water use on the lower main stem in carefully defined ways creates new or conserved water that can be top banked at Lake Mead. The contractors that conserve taking water from the main stem in 1 year accumulate credits that can be carried over at Lake Mead and delivered in later years. Again, the explanation in this illustration are oversimplified, and you should consult the references in my outline. The main type of ICS, extraordinary conservation, which is typically from fallowing irrigated lands using all the techniques that Bonnie talked about, cannot be traded interstate on the lower main stem, but the other types might be. In many ways, ICS is like the top banking at Lake Mead that was rejected in the 1990s. And that's chronicled in the La Bianca article. And that position shifted, though, with the onset of a hard drought. Intentionally created Mexican apportionment, which was talked about a little bit yesterday. ICS opened the door to binational water banking on the lower main stem. The concept was first articulated as a variation to ICS that was buried in the massive EIS on the interim shortage guidelines. It has since taken root in the promising dialogue between the U.S. and Mexico on how to manage shortages and restore river flows in Mexico, which was discussed yesterday. But the concept is the same, as illustrated on this hydrus. Investments to conserve Colorado River water in Mexico by improving the efficiency of the irrigation system by rotational fallowing or by desalinization can generate credits that are top banked in Lake Mead and then delivered for use in Mexico or in the United States. And such a mechanism has already been invoked for temporary fallowing by earthquake, as we heard yesterday. And it may be the only way to build up credits for delivery of the pulse flow, a kind of flood flow, to help restore riparian habitats along the river in Mexico. Not there yet. The Colorado Compact Water Bank in the Upper Basin. My last water banking example is just emerging from a diverse coalition in Colorado that includes East and West Slope water users, the state of Colorado, and the Nature Conservancy. This new coalition is seeking to proactively address the difficult questions about setting up a water bank well before a crisis hits due to compact curtailment, like how to organize the market mechanisms, how to offset the socioeconomic impacts of rotational fallowing on the West Slope, and how to maintain or enhance healthy river flows during water bank operations. Very conceptually, the bank would enable pre-compact rights in Colorado to voluntarily sign up for deposit and pooling. Yet to be defined critical post-compact rights could pay to make withdrawals instead of being curtailed due to a compact call. The reduced depletions under the pre-compact rights on deposit could then be exchanged for continued depletions under post-compact rights, making water bank withdrawals. The deposits from reduced depletions under pre-compact rights could also be carried over in storage for withdrawal by later release and exchange. This illustration of the illustration of this water bank on the hydrus requires first imagining what the river system might look like during compact curtailment, which is uncharted territory, but here we go. Without a water bank in place, post-compact exports to Colorado's Front Range may be curtailed and increase the flows in the upper main stem being delivered to Lee Ferry. With the bank in place, most of those exports would continue, and the increase in flows being delivered to Lee Ferry would come from the rotational fallowing of pre-compact rights lower in the system, or from the release of storage credits from earlier fallowing. This illustration is probably the most oversimplified, and there are no doubt a host of unintended consequences that it doesn't touch. One very big question is what happens when the only way to refill post-compact reservoirs is with pre-compact water rights. The Colorado Water Bank Group has got its work cut out and its sleeves rolled up. To conclude, I'd like to put water banking for the Colorado River Basin in the context of a recent report from a West-wide working group on water sharing and the paper framing this panel that Sarah Bates talked about at the beginning. The West-wide group on water sharing was responding to a call from the Western States Water Council for the states to work with interested stakeholders to identify innovative ways to allow water transfers from agricultural to urban use while avoiding or mitigating damages to agricultural economies and environmental values. They made these major recommendations: pilot an expedited review process for water sharing projects, foster a flexible basin-wide approach, create state cabinet-level advocates in voluntary water sharing zones, build exclusive and robust stakeholder processes for sharing agricultural water. Can we act on such recommendations when opening water banks for the Colorado River Basin? One take-home message for me from the paper framing this panel is that the footing ahead on the Colorado River is unstable, while a host of unresolved legal issues could confound solutions like water banking. So my questions for those leaders thinking like a river basin are: can we hold enough of the legal issues and potential conflicts in abatement to see how something like intentionally created Mexican apportionments or the Colorado Compact Water Bank can work? And can healthy rivers be part of the water banking solutions at both ends of the river, in Mexico and in Colorado?
Couple of minutes. If you'd like to ask a question now, and as well as afterwards.
Since we broached the topic of the Farm Bill in the previous topic, just a very quick question. If there were not federal crop subsidies, wouldn't that make many farmers much more anxious to participate in the water bank by fallowing their fields seasonally or permanently?
I don't know quite how the Farm Bill works, so it's a hard question to answer. I think it's important to look at how we can maybe align water banking with Farm Bill programs. A very important issue is how you take care of the land when you temporarily fallow it. And I think there might be some Farm Bill programs that would give us a nice bridge there. And that kind of combination, I think, would create a stronger incentive for this kind of water banking.
Wait. And then one more.
John Weiner, freelance pop gun. One of the interesting ecological and ecosystems issues is that we have substantially displaced the pre-development hydrology with a post-development 24/7 flow regime of municipal effluents and a substantially modified flow regime through the agricultural purposes of flow regulation and timing. What we now have is a hybrid ecology along almost all of the streams in the West, which depends in an unfortunately large degree upon return flows from irrigation. So one of the issues in our water transfers that is an emerging issue, scientifically easily demonstrable but not politically recognized very much, is the problem of removing that substitute for the original ecology, which is now providing the extent of the ecosystem services that we enjoy. Much of that is actually in some ways much more desirable than the pre-development. So we have a thorny issue that has not yet worked its way into the process, and I would like to know if the panel has a comment on how we can expand the sense of in-stream flow to a larger sense of preservation of those ecologies dependent now in part on irrigation.
It is a thorny issue. Once you rearrange the flows, it's hard to kind of really put them back, and so you're in all sorts of complex situations, evaluating the benefit of the ecological benefit of the existing flow regime and what the incremental benefit may be of altering that regime. One great example of that is the Cienega de Santa Clara that was talked about a bit yesterday. That is a return flow dependent wetland, and it's become a very complex and thorny issue how much of that return flow dependency to maintain, can we adjust it, what are the alternative supplies for that. I think it requires just a lot of careful examination, almost site by site. What can you fix? What can you protect? I don't think we've done a very good job of that across the Colorado River Basin. We've done it well in a few places, but I think we need a much more comprehensive look at just where we can restore flows, where we should protect them, and what that looks like.
One more, and we're off to Eric.
Robert, what do you see as the difference, if any, between motivations for participation in a water bank by water rights holders as compared to just individual water transactions between a single buyer and seller?
The main idea behind the water bank is to address kind of the high transaction costs of single transactions, and to find kind of transactional economies, set up an institutionalized process that makes it a lot easier, that streamlines, that just makes the transactions much more regular. And that's not easy to do. I mean, there's lots of complexities with any single water right transaction, and trying to imagine an institution that would cover thousands of transactions on the western slope of Colorado is pretty formidable. But that's the idea, is it's so difficult sometimes to put together the single transactions. You need kind of a warehouse that gives you much better economies.
Okay, Eric Kuhn, if you'll come up, and I think we've got to get your slides.
That works. Okay. All right. Well, thank you. Great conference. I want to thank especially Doug Kenny as one old gray-haired water buffalo. Keep it up. It keeps us coming to these conferences. Okay. I'm going to discuss something I called risk management strategies for the Upper Basin. I put together a little paper for it. I'm not quite ready to make it public yet. I'm waiting on some other things, but I have copies, and if you want to see a draft of it, let me know and I'll email you one. I work for the Colorado River District, which is one of 4 conservation districts in Colorado. It's the oldest. We're here simply because of trans-mountain diversions. We're a counter-irritant, is what our founder said, to the need to divert water from east of the Continental Divide to the west. There's our boundaries. I will say last year about 67% of the flow, not natural, but the actual flow at Lee Ferry originated in watersheds in our basin. So we're sort of the sweet spot in the Colorado as far as snowpack, along with the Uintas and the Wind Rivers. I want to mention a couple things and talk about what are the risk management strategies, risk against what. And I will say, Colorado, let's go back to the compact. Colorado, like all upper division states, has obligations at Lee Ferry. The first, of course, under 3D is to not cause the flow of the river at Lee Ferry to be depleted below an aggregate of 75 million over any 10 consecutive years. And for all of the benefit of all of the Upper Colorado River Commission people, it is not a delivery obligation. So if you leave this conference with one message, it's the Upper Basin does not have a delivery obligation. It has an obligation to not cause the flow to be depleted. All right, there we go. And is there a distinction without a difference? Maybe, but we'll talk about that later. Regarding Mexico, the Upper Division also has an obligation that's really not well understood by anybody and has been deferred by everybody since the 1940s. and that's that we must deliver at Lee Ferry, in addition to 3D, one half of the deficiency in the delivery to Mexico. And how that works is really, again, a subject of a whole new talk and perhaps conference. But those are the two obligations. Under the Upper Colorado River Compact, and I will say we talk a lot about the 1922 Compact, but the 48 Compact, which was ratified by 5 of the basin states — Arizona has upper basin interest — by Congress, is very, very important and will be more important in the future. And few people have actually even looked at that compact or the minutes of that compact, and there's some very interesting things in there. But the purpose of the compact is equitable division and apportionment of the use of the waters apportioned in perpetuity to the upper basin among the 5 upper basin states with interest, including Arizona, and establish the obligation of the states of the upper division, which is different than the upper basin. Arizona has upper basin interest, but is not a state of the upper division. And this has the obligations of the states of the upper division with respect to deliveries at water required at Lee Ferry. So the Upper Basin Compact has a really important role in the future under certain climate change scenarios. And the procedures and methodologies for determining how much water Colorado as a state and the others are included in that Upper Basin Compact. Okay, that's Article 4, A, B, and C of the 48 Compact. So there's also a very important thing, and that's Article 8 of the 1922 Compact, which I talk about in my paper. There's some very interesting comments by the commissioners in there, and that says present perfected rights to the beneficial use of waters of the Colorado system are unimpaired by this compact. And it was a property rights issue. And when I've read the minutes and I look at it, I'm actually very impressed with the sophistication of the commissioners at the time. They might be a little bit shocked by all our cell phones going off at these meetings, or they may be a little bit shocked by the lower hydrology, but they wouldn't be, in my view, at all. They could step right in and have a discussion with us on many of the property issues and many of these issues, even though they negotiated this compact 80-some years ago. So let's give them a lot of credit. They really were well-educated and very thoughtful people that developed that compact. And they knew what they were doing when they did this, and they were protecting existing property rights at the time. It's very simple. The 1948 compact recognizes this and excludes from certain critical provisions water rights perfected prior to November 24th, 1922. And I put a note down here. Arizona v. California may include a definition of present perfected rights. Remember, the court was interpreting the Boulder Canyon Project Act. The Boulder Canyon Project Act actually refers to Article 8. So there's a reference there, and it's basically, there's some real interesting discussion about the commissioners of what they were trying to do and what they were not, but we don't have time for that today. Here's the 10-year flow at Lee Ferry. That will tick up. We're closing in on 82.5. That will tick up next year as we deliver an extra 4. What are the variables that are out there for a curtailment risk? And I split them up into 3. The obligations at Lee Ferry is a variable because we don't know what the heck the 3C, the Mexican treaty obligation, means. So that's a variable. In the work that the CWCB did, and its Colorado River Water Availability Study, in some cases, half that variability is caused by different assumptions on what our obligations are at Lee Ferry under the Mexican treaty. It's almost as big, in many cases, as the hydrologic variability. Development in the upper basin. Again, a huge variable in curtailment risk. Things like additional trans-mountain diversions, things like oil shale, highly consumptive. So that's another one. And the third variable, of course, is future hydrology. What will it look like? Future hydrology, I think we're reaching a consensus. Upper basin demands are going to go up. New development, how fast that rate that's going to go up, we don't know. Upper basin existing uses will go up as temperatures go up. A very underappreciated factor on the river. Hugely underappreciated. Thanks to the CWCB, we know that when they model it and they put those temperature increases in based on existing uses, most of which are pre-1922 rights, that you could see a demand increase in the upper basin for existing uses for 500,000 to 1 million acre feet under some temperature some temperature increase scenarios. And that's if the water's there, if the reservoirs are sized to meet that water. There's a lot of ifs, but temperature increases may cause upper existing uses to go up more in the future than the incremental amount of new development in the basin. That's sort of my conclusion. And of course, precipitation. Jeff Lucas did a great job for the UCRC. I don't know if many of you saw that, but precipitation is a big if. We don't know what's going to happen in the basin. Hopefully we'll see a lot more years like this year, but who knows. Curtailment triggers, like I said. Do we have to curtail at 75/10? Pretty clearly, yes. There are some issues there. 82.5, probably not. That's maybe the lower basin's historical use of it, maybe more, or is it something in between? This is just a conceptual graph that shows the risk of curtailment versus temperature. If you see, I show it's low now. It'll go up very high based on large future temperature increases. It'll go up very high under moderate, but not extremely high. And even if you assume gauge hydrology will continue, and there's no climate change, and everything will look like it did in the 1900s, in the 2100s, there's still a risk of curtailment due to to additional upstream uses and normal climate variability that was already in the record. So there is a small risk. Impacts of curtailment. Pre-1922 rights, our assumption, and the assumption made by all of the authors of the 48 Compact is when there's a curtailment, pre-22 rights, however they're defined, are grandfathered out of it. They're not impacted. They're not impaired. Many of the West Slope cities where I come from have a mix of pre-1922 and post-1922 rights. Many of them have, Glenwood Springs, largely pre-1922 rights. Most of the newer communities, like ski areas, obviously are post-22. Major front range diverters, they're almost all post-1922. Snowmaking and thermal power plants, very important in the face of a curtailment, are almost all post-22. Strategies, and we'll talk about this real quickly. CRSP optimization. How do we use Powell and the other three reservoirs in a way to maximize insurance against a curtailment? We really haven't had that discussion in the basin. Second one, of course, that's why we have law schools, litigation. Litigation is a way, and it's also a way to increase your risk in a major way. Do the upper basin or the lower basin states really want to know whether it's 75 or 82.5 or something in between? Or are they better off with an agreement deciding that? So litigation might minimize the risk, or it might maximize our risk. Curtailment and contingency plans, Robert Wigington talked about that. That's the water banking. And my final one is new institutional arrangements, joint projects. Under joint projects, it's things like, things that make us feel good but don't do much for the river, like cloud seeding. As long as they only cost a few 100,000 acre-feet and the science doesn't tell us anything, they're good. There's dust abatement, which is a little more dicey, okay, but dust has a huge impact, but how are we going to deal with real dust abatement? There's, new large desalinization plants. They're going to be an important part of the future, but in the tens of thousands of acre-feet, not in the hundreds or millions, okay, which is what the problem is. And then there's finally is, what's the new institutional arrangement? In my paper, I talk about some innovative ideas. One of them that's talked about in the past is a general recognition that the upper basin has realized that living with a curtailment might be very difficult. The lower basin has a basic problem, is that the compact allocated 8.5 million acre-feet for its use. It's using about 11 now. And maybe there's a way that the basin states will see to come up with a solution where the upper basin recognizes this lower basin's current uses and the lower basin limits or minimizes any curtailment impacts on the West Slope. I call that the Albuquerque solution in my paper, and I explain why. So with that, I noticed I'm still on yellow. I will take a couple questions.
You sure can.
Anyway, I've got some other slides that I want to just pass on, but I want to take questions. This is the estimated uses of pre-1922 rights. in the minutes of the compact. You see they're fairly significant. There's a note that says this is a guess in the minutes. And risk management will be a priority, and entities that prepare today will have the upper hand in the future.
Thanks, Eric. Eric says sometimes he'd like to direct questions to him now.
Oh, good. I can duck.
There's a hand.
I just have a question about the 11.5 number, the million acre feet that you said in the lower basin. Could you just clarify what numbers you added up there to get at that?
I said about 11 million acre feet. Here's where I'm coming from on that. They're using about 7.5 deliveries to the lower, from main stem of the Colorado to Lake Mead, about 1 million to 1.5 million acre feet of consumptive uses associated with reservoir evaporation. It is a man-made depletion. It may not be under Arizona v. California, but it clearly is a man-made depletion caused by our construction of reservoirs. They're considered in the consumptive use. It makes up maybe 15 to 20% of many of the state's consumptive uses in the upper basin. And then there's the tributary use. The Colorado River, a portion of the Colorado River and its tributaries in the United States. So that's a big unknown as to what that number is, but if you assume that number is in the range of 2 to 2.5 million acre feet, you can see that total main stem uses, system evaporation, and tributary use, consumptive use, adds up to approximately 10.5 to 11.5 million acre feet. Look at the Colorado River consumptive uses and losses reports. They're old, they're outdated. I'm waiting for them to update it so I can use some more information in my paper, but I may not be able to wait long enough. But look at those on the Bureau of Reclamation website.
One more?
Eric, for those of us who are interested in incentive-based solutions, the proposed water bank is really exciting, and I wonder if you'd give us a quick summary on where the conversation stands as of this summer.
Well, the conversation as of the summer, as we've the River District Board and the Southwestern Board, two of the conservation boards in Colorado, started this process about 4 years. We've invited Nature Conservancy, the Front Range Water Council, sort of I call it a trade association for the Trans Mountain Diverters, and the state are looking at it. And the concept there, again, Robert said very simply, in the face of a curtailment, assuming the pre-1922 rights can be used to replace post-1922 depletions, is that Colorado essentially lives with its 1 to 1.1 million acre feet of pre-1922 rights during a curtailment, and this water bank allocates that in a market mechanism, allocates that water in a market mechanism. That's the basic idea.
Okay, let's...
do we have Melinda?
Yes, we have 30 seconds.
30 seconds. Eric, can you talk about... Melinda Casson, consultant. Eric, can you talk about what kind of institutional arrangements would be needed for the Albuquerque solution? In 30 seconds.
And he'll come back.
Maybe a new generation. A couple of curtailments, where we have some extreme hardships. No, I think what you're seeing, with the yesterday or 2 days ago, we talked about how the cities in the basin, whether they're lower basin or upper basin, whether they're Denver or Los Angeles or Phoenix, are looking at the basin study in a collective way. And I think that tells you that the lower basin cities recognize they don't like their junior priority, or the fact that they're using water that they may not have a legal entitlement to under the 22 Compact. And the upper basin cities are thinking, ooh, I don't know that we could survive in a curtailment. So that's the kind of thing that's moving forward. It is going to take years, but at the same time, it's an idea that's been out there. It's not new, and it should be discussed at forums like this.
Thank you, Eric. And we're moving along quite well. Les Lampe will come up. I was going to say, I thought those clouds going by had extra water in them for weather mod, but maybe not. No.
Well, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. And what I'm going to touch on will cover several of the themes that we had previously. And specifically, my entree to this was a comment by Bill Rennie yesterday where he was offering a state's perspective, not the state's perspective. And as part of the state's initiatives earlier and the EIS process on the shortage guidelines, the states had a commitment to the Secretary of Interior that they would do an augmentation study. Well, the group that was retained to do that augmentation study, I was part of that group, but it was called Colorado River Water Consultants and is a joint venture of CH2M Hill and Black and Veatch. And so it's that group that's continuing to carry forward in terms of some Colorado River work, and we're pleased to be part of that. Real quickly, okay, this was the Basin States Alternative. They committed to doing this study. Some things to emphasize here in terms of looking at these augmentation options. We were clearly directed not to look at legal, policy, and political aspects. We were to look at the technical aspects of these things. So we looked at cost, technical feasibility, and generally the amount of yield you could obtain for any of these augmentation options. Also, too, it's important to emphasize looking at these augmentation options, and the themes through these last couple of days are clearly what we'd be looking for in solutions are portfolios of solutions, not one silver bullet that's going to solve everything. So you have to look at these in terms of how it fits within things like extraordinary conservation and ag-urban transfers. Now, those two elements were specifically off the plate for us in terms of looking at augmentation options. So the immediate question would be, well, why didn't you look at extraordinary conservation, which would by default have to be part of any portfolio moving forward, or ag-urban transfers? That wasn't part of our charge here. So we looked at the range of other some very good, some not so good. You'll see as I go through this what the types of things were. The process was that we went out and met with all of the 7 states in a variety of venues. They defined how we got the input in terms of augmentation options and with the upper and lower regions of the Colorado Basin Bureau of Reclamation. For example, we met with the Green River Basin Advisory Council in Wyoming, because that's the Colorado River system in Wyoming, the Colorado Water Conservation Board when they met in Durango, that was our venue. But we solicited input, and we ended up with these 12 augmentation options. Now, you could read them off, and I could read them off, but I'm going to go through each one of them real quickly, so I don't want to spend a bunch of time on them. An important thing to notice on this, too, and there was a report put out in March of 2008 that summarizes all of this. This is the centerfold that has the quantities and costs and locations and everything like that. And that report is relatively readily available for anybody who wants to take a look at it. Another thing that it's important to realize, after going through the 12, the states themselves had a steering committee that shortlisted it down to these 6 for some priority, more detailed evaluation. Now that work is out there and it's available moving forward as part of the basin study, looking at strategies and options. And so it's just something that's out there as background and available. Now, important thing to look at on some of these, and we'll touch on them, like brackish water desalting, conjunctive use, ocean desalting, there are things moving forward now. It's not static, it's a process and some things are being done. We had financial assumptions going into how you come up with the costs, just to put it on a level playing field. Now, within each of these, and touching on them real briefly, the brackish water desalting quickly focused on where's brackish water available, and the primary source of that was in the Yuma area of Arizona. There's a mound of brackish groundwater that's built up there that could, by the replenishment of the ag drainage water, could provide probably 100,000 acre feet a year just by mining that mound, or just use the straight ag drainage water. Well, the beauty of this is that there's the Yuma desalting plant, the largest desalting plant in the United States, roughly 73 MGD capacity, and the funders, Metropolitan, Southern Nevada Water Authority, and Central Arizona Water Conservation District, have moved forward jointly with Reclamation to fund a pilot study that's created 30,000 acre feet of water that benefits both the United States, the states, and Mexico in terms of creating. It's a a creative use of looking at brackish supplies and availability in a facility that's already there, and a creative way of making use of that facility. So that's moving forward right now. Pilot run is essentially done, the looking at cost refinement, but it's performed better than expected. Coal bed methane water. Some people said there's huge amounts of water. You mine the methane from coal beds to generate this water. We generally found out that it's quite dispersed. The wells fall off in production very quickly, and it's crummy water. It's just not an easy way to make use of this. It's more of a nuisance than a resource, and that's unfortunate, but that's what we found through this study. Conjunctive use is essentially water banking, and if you move into that, you can look at in Southern California and in Arizona in terms of the facilities that were looked at to come up with supplies, and we've had several discussions in terms of the benefit of the water banking and how it's been used for multi-state purposes, where Nevada is cooperating with both Arizona and California in terms of banking and cooperation to make this work, but it fits too in terms of a lot of themes of you store the water underground in times of surplus, pull it out in times of need, and you don't have the evaporation associated with it, things like that too. Ocean water desalting, high energy, high cost, but it's in the portfolio. And people are looking at moving forward in terms of a study right now that's looking at, can't see the map that well, but you go down into Baja, California, down into Mexico, an area called Rosarito. There's a study being done right now to look at a facility down there and how that would work. Supplying water in Mexico and then being wheeled back to by exchanges and trades to supply water to the upstream states, particularly the lower basin. It's being funded by the San Diego County Water Authority, Metropolitan Water District, Southern Nevada Water Authority, and Central Arizona Water Conservation District. So another example of this collaboration and collaborative spirit moving forward. Power plants, we've had some mention in terms of the consumption of water from power plants, and it's huge. You use about 700 gallons per megawatt hour of production in a conventional power plant. And just by this analysis, we came through and we tabulated these up. These are only the ones using water from the main stem or the major tributaries of the river. And just by converting these to non-evaporative cooling, you'd save 160,000 acre feet. Now, obviously, huge financial, institutional problems. Related to that, you lose a lot of power generation efficiency when you go to that, just because of the thermal gradient that you're trying to do with the cooling. So big challenges, but it could be an opportunity. Costs associated with that and the quantity. Reservoir evaporation control, two elements, chemical covers, and preferential upstream storage where you have lower evaporation in upstream reservoirs. This is not particularly feasible either. The chemical covers don't work well, the ping pong balls don't work well on huge reservoirs, and preferential upstream storage, okay, you try to store it in Lake Powell rather than Lake Mead, yeah, don't even want to go there in terms of the institutional, legal, regulatory aspects of what's involved in that. River basin imports, obviously a low controversy item. This is the map with no lines on it. And as we went through this study, we had a lot of lines on there, and I'm going to show you one just for the shock effect associated with it. But we looked at a lot of those, and there are some that are very elegant in terms of how they fit within the regulatory system, the water rights system, low cost, could be done. And particularly when you look at a third of the water of the Colorado goes outside the basin, nothing comes back in, you could argue a little bit of logic of equity in terms of trying to do something like that. But hugely political. Now, just in terms of the shock effect one, that was where earlier Bill said, well, let's go to Canada, let's go to the Great Lakes. He didn't say, let's go to the Mississippi. So that's why that one's up there. No, actually the state said, okay, just as a template, just as a cost comparison, using the largest pipeline possible, and if you went to this source of supply, where right now the Mississippi people would be glad to get rid of water, but they have low flow periods too, and huge environmental things. Drew earlier mentioned the cost of pumping water, and it'd be thousands of megawatts of energy associated with it. But it gives you, this is the bookend of a portfolio in terms of saying the range of kind of things that you could be looking at. Stormwater storage, the only viable one when you started looking at what could be out here is the surge flows coming down the Gila River into a Painted Rock Reservoir. Those are pretty rare. And when we went through the economics, and particularly the yield evaluation, there just wasn't a lot of yield there, and the quality of the water, when you do get the inflows, is crummy, and it just wasn't particularly viable. Vegetation management, the tamarisk and the salt cedar, same thing. In the virgin muddy area, as well as down in the lower Colorado area, looking at that control. Huge amounts of water being consumed through that, but it's very difficult. A lot of effort's gone into it, and probably more will be done, but it's very challenging. Water imports using ocean routes. This was a historical thing going up to the Columbia River and an undersea aqueduct coming down, and you know, we looked at anything and everything. Old tankers, old single-hull tankers that are no longer usable for oil transport, towing water bags. We had a lot of purveyors coming forward saying, I've got a new and better system, and would you look at it, towing icebergs, although with climate change we may not have any to tow. You know, all of those elements, this just illustrates the range of kinds of things that were put on the table to make sure you're covering all of the portfolios. Reuse, and within this, it's important to recognize that reuse was only effective where you're reusing water from the Colorado River that's going particularly outside the basin. If it's in Las Vegas, it's being reused anyway. All of the return flows go back into Lake Mead. Now, if you look in Southern California or the Front Range of Colorado, that's Colorado River water that could be reused for beneficial purposes. Weather modification has been mentioned, and looked at it, the science is uncertain, the cost could be low, you know, but it's a long way to go in terms of what might work or not. So this report that was completed almost, 3 years ago now, came up with this range of costs, range of available supplies, and looked at these what could be parts of portfolios of supplies to be available, to be looked at moving forward. So this was the response of the states moving back and responding to the Secretary of Interior saying, yes, we're going to look at all of these different options. Yes, we're going to move them forward. Yes, they should be on the table and considered. And we are willing to pay to get the technical background and assemble the information that could be used in that regard. So that final report was issued 3 years ago. It was an interesting exercise. It kind of has a life of its own in terms of moving forward, particularly different elements and how they're being used or not used and whatever the case might be. And I'm sure a lot of it will come back up as we're moving through the basin study process. So with that, that's kind of the 100-mile-an-hour overview of a whole bunch of stuff there. And conference is open.
Even with 27 slides, let's save time for a couple of questions to grab through them, and that's what a professional can do.
Yeah, Kevin.
Yeah, one quick question for you, Les. I'm always interested in some of these augmentation issues. In terms of looking at what happens if they are creating dependencies upon these alternative sources, for example, cloud seeding, and suddenly developing economies based on getting this extra amount of water, and then weather patterns change, and suddenly that cloud seeding is not available in 10 years, 20 years. Have you been looking at that? Or the pipeline cost issues, creating these dependencies that we may increase our populations and our economic dependencies within the West to suddenly have this taken away in the future?
Yeah, you know, absolutely. That's a great question. It gets back to a lot of the earlier comments, particularly on the risk that Eric referred to. What's the risk of things not working in the future? And several times we've seen that funnel where it looks at plausible alternative futures. And one of the worst things that you want to have happen is you invest a whole bunch of resources into any one solution, and then you find out that that solution isn't working. And that's what's part of the basin study process, is looking at these portfolios that would be more robust in terms of solution sets. And for example, if you're counting on cloud seeding and the weather patterns change and that doesn't work, that should be part of your risk assessment as you're putting together a portfolio. Now, in terms of having the perfect science to define that risk, or even if you had a pipeline to the Mississippi and saying, okay, you build it and you spend billions of dollars, and 10 years from now, something's going to happen to where they say, you know what, you can't divert water anymore. That's a huge sunk cost, and that's what's the nature of the process. You want to have the portfolios that will address these and be resilient, as opposed to any one thing.
One more.
I'm Ben Tabor. I'm with the Colorado College State of the Rockies project. I was just wondering what kind of time scale you were looking at. A lot of these augmentation projects are a big upfront cost, like the or the Mississippi pipeline,
Right.
Whereas others would, towing icebergs would be a cost that spread out over many, many years. So are you looking at 10-year, 50-year time scales?
There was no specific time limit identified within each of these. Each one of the options itself is just like you say, has its own lead time that would be required. Something like a big pipeline to somewhere is, in the decades in terms of environmental concerns and permitting and everything else, legal aspects associated with it, or if some entity wanted to go out and say, we're going to start towing icebergs, that could be done relatively quickly. But all of it was looked at, too, in terms of the timing. We had ease of implementation and feasibility within there as items that we looked at, but it wasn't a specific time frame that we're saying, oh, gee, we want to have X amount of water by when. It was just, here's the overview of all of them.
Okay.
Okay.
We'll come back to more questions, and or let me make sure I know where we are in the program. Yes, thanks. Our last panelist patiently waiting is Larry McDonald. What a pleasure to introduce Larry back at an NRLC event. Take it away.
Wait. Okay.
I
need every minute of my 12 minutes here. Let's see which one it is. Oh, there it is, yeah. Great, thank you. All right, Bill, thank you, and always great to be here, of course. Drew kind of talked about the prerogatives of the youth and their ability to see things fresh. I'm here to speak on behalf of the aged. And partly, to talk about the things you learn and how you then try to incorporate what you learn into the very complex world of the Colorado River system. And let me just talk specifically about what's driving this presentation that I'm giving here today. And it is the threat that was became much more clear to us in the Upper Basin in the mid-2000s, 2002, 3, 4, and 5. When the prospect of curtailment became something more than just, a vague concept. It became a possibility, not an imminent possibility, but a possibility. And in terms of what Doug has talked to, the Upper Basin squeeze, what I think almost becomes essential if you are a person living in the Upper Basin is, what could we do to attempt to stop that curtailment? Are there legal solutions to that? That's litigation. And that was really where we were. We were looking more seriously, I think, at those prospects during that period of time, and it tends to focus the mind a little bit. What I started to do was to imagine what that litigation scenario might be, and found many, many options for litigation. We could spend a lot of time litigating in the Colorado River. There are, as you've heard, many issues that would be ripe for litigation should we decide to go that route. And none of them are good options. None of them really, I think, do what I think most of us here really would like to see have done, which is to make good use of this basin's resources. So I started out thinking, well, I'll do the usual academic thing here, we're talking about the assumptions and all that kind of good stuff. But what really this boils down to is my fear, my sense that we are at a time in which it is essential for us to look at difficult questions in a way that we haven't historically been willing to do. And I'm taking the prerogative of an academic, and I'm going to be a little bit outrageous here in trying to offer some perspectives. But they are ones that I got to in my own thinking as I tried to imagine this world that we are seeing, the world in which the Bureau of Reclamation itself has recognized we are oversubscribed already in the basin. And the prospects before us are not good. We know that all of us intend to and want to, and in fact have on the boards, drawing boards, specific projects to use more water. That's inherent in the way we think about the system. And so each of us, each of our states, all of our uses, we'd like to increase them. So that's sort of built into our expectation. We are aware that if global warming has the effects that it appears to have, we are probably talking about less, not more water to work with. If you think about then from this upper basin perspective what that means, it means that we will be in a position where we feel the need to protect our water uses, and that really drives litigation. That's when litigation becomes an alternative that becomes possible. So that's the sort of where I started thinking, what are ways to rethink this world in which we are faced, in which we actually might be able to come up with something that is a more plausible set of assumptions to work with and a future that might make some better sense. And I tried to imagine what that would be, and it is not a simple thing to do. These are obviously just one person's views, but the first and the foremost in my mind was to recognize that we are already fully subscribed. That then forces us to think more clearly about our commitment to supporting additional uses, new consumptive uses of basin water. Because if we in the upper basin make that commitment, we will then feel the need to defend those uses. We will be obligated, because people will be expecting and relying on those supplies of water, to, if there is the threat of a curtailment, think about the possibilities of trying to resist that through litigation. That will become part of where we end up being because of our normal concerns about ensuring the security, the certainty, the reliability of our water supplies. That's not a pleasant prospect to think about. So you start trying to think about, can you imagine a world in which there is this broad commitment to the idea of some limitation on the amounts of new uses that we would make. And then from that, some other elements emerged in my thinking, and I'll go through those very briefly and see if I can explain to you the thought process. So this first one really has to do with this idea of essentially looking at the basin system as already fully subscribed and trying to work within those limits. Obviously, that doesn't mean that all water uses stop. It means that water uses have to adjust. It does mean that if there are new uses, that they would face two options. One would be to replace existing depletions so that they, in fact, inherit the seniority of that existing right that they are using to replace their depletions with, or they take on the recognition that they are going to be an insecure right, that they are facing the prospect of curtailment. And I would urge that we would, as new development goes forward without replacing its depletions, that those water rights be made very explicit. They would be the first to be curtailed. We would not make a commitment to trying to litigate issues in order to protect their security. That would simply not be something we would commit to do. Now, of course, this falls heavily, almost entirely, on the upper basin. That is a thought that no good upper basin person could ever accept. And so, on the first blush, you go, "Are you kidding? What are you talking about?" But it comes up in the context of this much more complex basin, that there are other pieces that we could talk about in a negotiation trying to work with. One of those is the Leaf Ferry flow, and this is an example of an issue that could be litigated. The whole question is sort of what is the upper basin's obligation to the lower basin. There are many interpretations. Any good lawyer could come up with a half dozen that could be plausibly litigated. But in lieu of that, one way that I would propose thinking about it is that this become a more flexible notion, with the objective being a commitment to trying to ensure that the lower basin, in fact, is able to make the uses to which it is entitled under the compact, not rigidly based on some certain amount of water that has to pass a certain point, but rather that there be this effort to try to manage our system, the two big reservoirs, in a way that would help to secure to the lower basin a flow, an amount of water in Lake Mead that would make more certain the lower basin's rights under the compact. And that includes Mexico as well. Then here's the hard part for the lower basin, just to really think about how this could even be discussed by people here in the upper basin. As you know, under the second Article 3A of the compact, the lower basin and the upper basin each are entitled to 7.5 million acre feet of consumptive use annually. And what I'm suggesting here is to take that directly as the basis for what the lower basin can rely on. And a lot of this is, in my mind, thinking about the issue of certainty. I think we all have heard, we in the water community are very concerned about having security to the degree that is possible with a variable resource. And what I'm suggesting here is to make secure to the lower basin that apportionment that is established, the 7.5 million acre feet of annual consumptive use in the lower basin system. So that would be their challenge. As Eric has pointed out, currently the lower basin substantially exceeds that amount of water consumption and depletion. So they would be challenged to come up with ways in which this could be done. Surplus remains a desire on the part of many people. I think that's flexibility the system needs. I would say that would have to be foregone. Obviously, money is going to be necessary to make that happen, and so that's part of the suggestion that's offered there. Fundamentally, then people would say, but that's unrealistic. Can this be done? Well, we've talked about the idea of reallocation for a long time. I think we may be looking to really test what our possibilities are in this area, whether water banks or other mechanisms are really sufficient to enable that. But I would say as a part of this process, the states would need to make a commitment to facilitating that reallocation. There is a lot of water in the system. To the degree we can allow it to move freely, flexibly, I think it is not unrealistic to think about that being possible. I guess what I'm thinking about here is that essentially the cool heads that prevailed, like Jim Lockhead's during that very difficult period of the mid-2000s, and kind of brought the basin states together around shortage criteria, essentially gave us 20 years. That was really the gift that they produced. And we have that period of time to try to see if we can come to some sort of resolution that might actually provide a long-term framework in which this system, as challenged as it is, could operate. Now, you can tell that the sort of concepts that I'm proposing here are enormously challenging, and I'm sure at first blush are wildly unacceptable. But what drives me and why I have come to feel like it's worth at least putting that out on the table is this sense that the alternatives will be at some point, maybe not until 20 years, that litigation will be our future. Thank you.
Specific questions or comments for Larry, and then we'll get the whole panel back up.
Larry, some of us remember California's proposal about 15 years ago for interstate water leasing. Nothing happened. The upper basin states pulled back very quickly. But what's the prospect for interstate water leasing? We have excesses, New Mexico, Arizona, short of water. What's the prospect for that institutional change?
Well, there was a lot of active talk in the 1980s, and at that time it looked like there really was some water available for that kind of transaction. My sense, Chuck, is that that water is gone. I mean, we do not have water in the upper basin that we can, even temporarily, make available to the lower basin. That is no longer an option for us.
Even in a year like this year?
Well, of course, in a given year, but every time you make a commitment, you begin to tighten up your options. And to the degree then reliance is made on the basis of that availability of water, that's fine, so long as people understand that's that moment in time. So if there's surplus water in the system and allocations can be made of it, well, maybe that's going to be part of the bargaining process, I suppose. I wouldn't do it. I would say that's water we need to keep in our system to enable us to get through the harder periods, which inevitably will come. So that's kind of my sense.
Joe.
What type of arrangements did you have in mind that would be allowed by the general obligation to manage more 9 million acre feet in the lower basin of Mexico if that were substituted for the specific requirement to allow 75 million acre feet flow every 10 years.
Yeah, I think
what were you thinking of there?
I think that's, obviously be a huge challenge for the lower basin to try to manage, but they, right now, as you have heard, the numbers indicate somewhere from 10 to 11 million acre feet of depletion of water in the lower basin, tributary and main stem. And so what we're talking about is some amount of water necessary to enable 7.5 million acre feet to happen. Roughly what it looks like, and Eric again has done some work on this, about 10 million acre feet has to be available in the lower basin to enable that, plus the 1.5 million to go to Mexico. How the lower basin reduces that, how it manages that, I think is really up to the lower basin. And they would find, I think, many creative options. You see them going on, discussing, we're working on those right now. What worries me about what's going on right now is these are intended to increase uses. That, I don't think, is possible. I don't think we can be being more efficient, using incidentally created surplus to increase reliance on new uses. That, I think, is a mistake because it's further eliminating the ability for the system to actually function. So my desire would be that you begin to really cut back so that you have pulled within what I think is a more realistic water budget for the basin, one that could accommodate the in-stream flow issues that many of us are very concerned about, but also meet with security the consumptive uses that we depend on. So is that a challenge? You bet. I mean, it's outside of our scheme of thinking. Is it doable? I think it is. I think it is.
Well, let's get all the panelists back. If Drew and Bonnie and Sarah will need an extra chair down here. If maybe Bonnie can haul the chair down. And there's one more. In the 1980s, I was working with some graduate students for an EPA project to report to Congress on climate impacts on water. And we were told by the project manager, Joel Smith, some of you know Joel, that Congress had told us we couldn't use an option of moving water from the Great Lakes. And within 15 minutes, some of the students drew maps moving water. One of the students, Jeff Jacobs, who's at water science, he managed to get water from the Great Lakes to the Bay Delta. That was before PowerPoint. Those maps don't exist anymore. I think there is I want to get this up. A PowerPoint. It's called Solutions. Yeah, just so that you remember the whole panel, and we've also inviting you to make your own suggestions, so you don't have to ask a question. But then, of course, the panel gets to comment on your suggestions. So, off we go.
Yeah, Kurt Brown with Reclamation.
Speak into that thing strongly, I think.
Hello? Yeah. Good, okay. Just wonder what we can learn from the recent Nebraska experience with LB 962, which has led to both curtailments of new use and rollback of existing use as maybe some glimpse of maybe the future in this basin or mechanisms for getting use more in balance with supply.
I'll just say that Nebraska worked really hard to try to mitigate some of the impacts on the agricultural economy, and I don't have in my memory cells the exact mechanisms they used to do that, but my sense is that it's a pretty good example from talking to people who represent the agricultural sector in Nebraska, and given the serious repercussions they were faced with if they didn't come up with more flexibility. I don't know if anybody else can speak to it more specifically, but it's a good reminder to look at.
Yeah, I can probably say a few things about it. Kurt, of course, you were there, so you know kind of the drivers there. I mean, it's a great example of how we're oversubscribed in a lot of places. This Colorado River Basin is not the only place where we're really facing these issues. And there in Nebraska, in order to begin to manage the groundwater depletions, because of the effects they were having on the surface water system, it became necessary and never before done in Nebraska to actually start regulating groundwater pumping in that state. That was unthinkable, just as what I have suggested is unthinkable. But it happened, and it is part, I think, and this is where, you know, Drew gets to play these things out. I'm checked out of here, but, you know, it's going to be there.
Thanks, Larry.
I'm kind of, I'm kind of expecting that's, you know, that's where we're headed.
I would just like to add from the board I work for's perspective, we look at Colorado, we look at what's happened on the Platte, we look at what's happened on the Rio Grande and the Arkansas, now on the Republican, and the message is that if you allow overdevelopment to occur, agriculture and the environment are always the losers. And that's why it's very difficult, you know, that's why we're going to have to, if we move forward with large new Colorado River development, we're going to have to address how you do that in a way that doesn't recreate the problems we've seen, not just in Nebraska, but on the Republican and the Rio Grande and in the Arkansas and Colorado.
I will definitely get over in that direction.
Bill, I wanted to add something. You know, I see a very strong connection between the Albuquerque proposition, as Eric has described it, and some of Larry's thinking, where it's just very risky to encourage significant new uses in the Upper Basin, and that the main solution here is learning to live within our current uses. And there might be some important kind of increments of a little bit of new use in the Upper Basin. You know, how much, you know, existing use is there really that has to be worked out. But I'm kind of hearing that's kind of the fundamental idea here, is we have to learn to live within our current uses.
Thanks. Peter Nichols, I'm a water and environmental attorney. Jim mentioned this morning that the QSA was the largest transfer of ag to urban water ever. Bonnie mentioned that fallowing may be something that works in the future, inherent in the proposal that Robert talked about and Eric talked about to deal with a potential compact call in Colorado. And Drew mentioned that as well as a way to meet some of the needs of the Front Range of Colorado. Implicit in all this discussions is that major transfers from the agricultural sector are going to be required to meet the needs of the other uses in the basin in the future. And my question really goes back to the opening panel this morning, but I'm going to pose it to you. And that is, you know, how do you get agriculture, should agriculture be part of the discussion? And how do they become part of the discussion? Because they don't have a series of NGOs funded by sophisticated fundraising campaigns and large litigation chests that can bring them into the discussion.
If you're going to play poker, you have to have a good hand and money. If you're going to play in the water game, senior water rights are a really good bargaining chip, and that's what agriculture has. And it's true, they do better when they're well organized, and you have spoken about that yourself at this conference in previous years with the Big Ditch.
Well, I see the water bank that we're talking about in western Colorado is a way to allow the irrigated community to get organized and to, you know, not respond to kind of single transactions, to, you know, kind of more opportunities, but to, you know, be organized, to be able to kind of act together. So a water bank is a way for the irrigated community to really be involved. I think, Peter, you know that on the Arkansas, and that, you know, that it really doesn't work unless the irrigated community is, you know, deeply involved in driving the bank.
I'd be interested in hearing Peter's suggestion as to how the entities he's been working with might fit into some of these various institutional options that we've described here. What would have to change for that to be an effective voice?
Well, I think two things would have to change, and thanks for this, Eric. the questions here, and I wasn't trying to set that up, but something that people have talked around this morning is price. For most farmers and ranchers in the Western U.S., they say, water is their 401k. And I think traditionally people have thought of that 401k as, okay, you sell your water and then you invest in the stock market or something else and you live off of that. An alternative would be water leases could be your 401k, and you could have a 40-year stream of income off of those particular leases. So price would be an important thing to bring them to the table. And the second thing I think that might bring them to the table is a willingness of other water users to discuss leases with agricultural entities as opposed to purchases and buy and draw. Everybody seems pretty comfortable with 40-year leases from the Bureau of Reclamation with the full knowledge that when you renew that contract, ESA or something else may say that you get substantially less water for your next 40 years. Municipalities seem to be awfully reluctant to enter into those 40-year contracts, not all of them, but many of them. And if that could change a little bit, I think that would make the farming community and the agricultural community feel a little bit less beleaguered and a little less afraid of coming to the discussion, because they're afraid they're coming to the discussion basically just to sort of work out a system that they're going to sell their water rights and be dried up, and those communities in those agricultural areas are going to go away in the future.
Norm D. Weaver, is there any way to directly address the juggernaut of population in migration in the lower basin states that's going to drive the demand for new water?
Norm, I think that's a great idea that's often been taboo amongst water managers about talking about the population issue. And one of the ways that I think that will get addressed is through land use planning. And traditionally, water providers have stayed away from that, but there are some very good examples from the Southern Nevada Water Authority and from the East Bay Municipal Utilities District about actually taking land use planning under their own purview. And I think there is a significant opportunity for providers to be more upfront and directive about how new development gets built within their service area.
And it goes both ways. It goes to water providers dealing with land use issues, and it goes to land use planners and local decision makers dealing with water issues. So it's a two-way area of thinking that needs to change, and there's progress in both, but a long way to go. And there's pretty hard to just shut the door on new people coming in, but there are ways of regulating how development happens and how you incorporate water concerns into new development patterns. And really, you've described quite a few of those. In the materials, or I guess in the bio, I listed a report that we just put out on integrating land use and water, and that is available, and it has some of the strategies and some of the obstacles too analyzed in it.
Just to add to that, one thing that hasn't been well done yet, but we hope maybe will be, particularly in the basin studies, and Bill Travis and I were talking about this, is we look at population projections and increases. We also need to keep in mind that water and energy costs are going to be going up. There's some good projections of that, and people respond. There's a genuine flexibility response in urban and agricultural sectors as price changes. So we've been looking at population increases, but we haven't built in yet the factor of changing costs to households, businesses, and farms, and how water use will respond to that. Even though there is good documentation in it, it wouldn't be difficult to do, at least at a rough level.
Yeah, I saw your hands up. We have the luxury we've got 15 to 20 more minutes. We even have follow-ups from the audience.
Sorry about the follow-up, but to make the question easier to answer, how do you deal with the political implications of that? I live in Arizona, and the study of the Arizona legislature is an interesting example of how one would want to impose, kind of some kind of land use, water planning nexus on the forces at play in Arizona.
Okay, next question.
You get points for stumping the panel.
Hi, I'm just one of the, I think it was mentioned at the beginning of the conference, it's something like, in this state, 80% of the people live on the east Front Range and probably have very little connection with agriculture. most of us don't realize that 80% of water is basically being used for irrigation. In this state, it's mostly for animals. Since we're in the business of talking about predictions, I would have thought that there might well be a political change, that the 80%, that's not going to go away, that is here. Urbanization is happening. It's probably more likely that rather than trying to put the onus on curbing in-migration to the cities, which already exists, there might be pressure from the cities to have the senior rights people have to justify a bit more responsibly their monopoly on the pre-1922 basis, etc.
Yeah. Any comment?
They are what they are. I mean, the pre-1922 rights were there, and they're using, and they're documented through decrees, and many of them are actually held by districts and irrigation districts. Some of them held by the federal government, at least in Colorado. So I don't see changing that. It's like justifying the size of your house.
I also think that the water bank is a way to kind of create a new relationship between the irrigated community and the urban users. Both sides need to be organized. Both sides need to be talking rationally, and kind of taking a more planned approach to this monopoly, as you put it.
I would just like to comment on the question, what can we do to slow the juggernaut of urban growth? It seems to me that what needs to be done is not necessarily affirmative limiting, but to stop affirmatively encouraging it. I mean, most water project proposals and water plans I see say, okay, our first priority is to provide water for the coming urban growth. And most water planners assume that it is their job to supply water for unlimited future urban growth. And simply, if we stopped doing that, we wouldn't necessarily need to use land use planning to slow it. It would slow itself if we didn't keep feeding it.
If I could respond, I don't know if you can have a significant amount of growth, economically, population, without growth in water demands. There's this kind of assumption that I think you made that a juggernaut in growth means a juggernaut in water demands. I don't think that's the case, and I think what Drew has suggested is that the planning today is about how to have growth with less and less water. Yeah.
Yeah, without my lawn, I would be, my footprint would be so much smaller. Be watered as we speak.
Mike? Well, I had a question around that line and having to do with the use possibly of withdrawal of purchase of development credits in some way as a way of managing growth or restricting it, because I think sometimes at a local level things are counterintuitive. For example, the town of Superior here in Boulder County hooked into a major developer because they had lousy water, and if they built a big development, good water would come in with the clout of somebody. It took the size to buy that. And historically, Pawnee Grasslands was created when the whole idea of plow in the water was became obviously a failure with the Dust Bowl. I live in northern Colorado in a town that needs to grow because they overbuilt their sewer treatment plant to the extent that they can't afford, they need the people to come in. And are there ways, rather than doing that or doing that in a more sensible fashion, as opposed, say, to a system of looking at agriculture and saying fallowing farmland, look at some of this not yet built golf course and saying, if we don't do that as a way of partly fostering conservation.
So tradable development rights only occur where a urban area or a city council or metropolitan governance unit has said we are capping new development, and within that cap we allow trading of development rights. So when that political will arises, as it has in a number of urban areas, tradable development rights actually could be an interesting and complementary tool to some of the things we've been talking about in water management in urban areas. But it takes a lot for cities to get to the point where they're willing to do that. I mean, in Aspen, you have all this trading of tens of thousands of square feet of large residences in their tradable development right program, but most cities are not Aspen or Portland.
Okay, back here. This question is for Eric. I was wondering if you could talk more about the Albuquerque proposal and kind of how it was developed and who you think the major proponents and opponents would be, and kind of how it fits in with this bigger discussion of solutions.
I'm not sure I quite got the question. Could you
About the Albuquerque proposal, more about it and kind of how it was developed and major opponents and proponents.
Yeah, I just called it that because that's where it was. My memory of it first started was it was in a 7-basin state meeting in Albuquerque, and it's very similar to what Professor McDonald put down, which is as you move forward, you're looking at some sort of trade-off between the unacceptable outcomes in the basin. And we've heard a lot about what those unacceptable outcomes are. In the lower basin, it's the junior priorities of the CAP and the Metropolitan Water District and the idea that they could even live within what the compact may have contemplated that they were going to use. And in the upper basin, it's the impact of a curtailment on the junior uses, and does that set the framework for some sort of interim solution, that's out there? I don't see it as a long-term. I mean, it's probably going to have to be in incremental steps to move it forward. But again, this wasn't our idea, or it's not a new idea. It's just a recognition of what the forces are out there and what are the unacceptable outcomes on the table that folks are out there to address. I think Pat Mulroy talked about the same idea Wednesday night, if you kind of interpreted what she said in a different way. Yeah, and I say that because you remember at the end she says it's no longer going to be about state, it's no longer going to be about basin to basin or state to state. She sees the future conflicts as use to use. And I think that was her summary, that was a summary at the end.
Am I speaking loudly into the machine? My name is Beth Miller. I'm one of those lower basin people, so thanks for the shirt. I did want to ask the panel, I work as a water professional in a large municipality in Arizona, and we as water professionals don't often have the choices to make about whether we're going to go acquire water for what our policymakers tell us, the growth levels they want us to have. So I'd be curious if any of the panel members have any suggestions or have any experience on what it takes when what does it take for a political entity to get to the point where it's willing to limit its water supply, when your political body is willing to do that? Does anybody have any experiences or can give us any insight on what that takes?
Well, it's usually in response to crisis, and the costs have grown too high to be acceptable, and that isn't just economic costs. It's economic, social, and environmental costs are to the constituents and the political leaders unacceptable of the direction in which it's going. And when that happens, suddenly using less or no net increase, doing offsets for new construction, places like Santa Fe have addressed that, other communities have as well, but it's generally in response to a crisis of, not just a water shortage, but a crisis of what's acceptable being surpassed.
At a local scale more than
I think it happens more on a local scale. And in response to that earlier question about how do you get your state, if you're working with the state legislature that might not want to impose these sorts of things, this is often still permissible at a local level if it's necessary to respond to what is perceived as a crisis. In some places, we have crises of development patterns dependent on unregulated wells, for example, and the state legislature is, I'm talking from my home state, unwilling to tighten down on those, but it's happening in closed basins where it's starting to impact surface water users. The local governments are the ones petitioning for authority to tighten up on this, and they're trying to incorporate these into their local land use planning. It happens often just out of individual conditions, and then that can be a pilot for how policies may be set on a larger scale.
Yeah, go ahead. Okay. Real quickly, just, a lot of times what happens here too, we look somewhat provincially just within the Colorado River system and not look elsewhere in terms of things that have happened in that regard too. And one of the examples that I like, because I think there's a lot of comparability in it, is comparing the Colorado River system to things that have happened in Australia. And so particularly I think of in southeast Queensland in 2002 when they had an extraordinary drought. Well, it was a combination. They went to their 140 plan, which was 140 liters per person per day. And we take 140 liters, that's about 35 gallons per person per day that they cut back from. And they cut it more than in half. Well, combined with that, they also had huge expenditure in ocean desalting and a 120-mile pipeline to take recycled wastewater back to Lake Wivenhoe. So it was, it was that local solution in terms of demand, but also too, it was, doing a whole bunch of things to respond to it. Yeah. The crisis.
I just wanted to point out that the Colorado River Cooperative Agreement that Jim Blockhead mentioned includes kind of a new provision saying Denver is not going to expand its service area. That's a kind of key part of that whole agreement with the Western Slope, and it's always been kind of a fundamental threat. And it wasn't kind of quick in coming. It was, as Jim explained, a very difficult, long negotiation, and it wasn't just about the service area. There are a whole bunch of other things that kind of went into that marvelous agreement. But I think those are the kinds of agreements that are possible and that are starting to occur and are ways of living within our budgets.
Hi, I'm Felicity Hannay. I'm the U.S. Commissioner on the Upper Colorado River Commission. I'm looking at Larry McDonald because I understood, I think, from the arithmetic of your reducing prospective and existing uses that you were imagining a significant reduction in the amount of water that Mexico could count on from the Colorado River. If I added up 7.5 million and 1 million and then 9 million, it looked like 500,000 acre feet as opposed to 1.5 million acre feet going to Mexico. I just wondered if I realized that this was really a thought process stimulator, but could you speculate, or any of the rest of you who are willing to think the unthinkable, speculate about how that might happen in the context of an international treaty?
I did not intend to reduce Mexico's treaty entitlement.
It's lawyers doing math,
Yeah.
That probably explains it a lot. I'm not sure which of us.
I'm not even a lawyer anymore.
What the million that you added in there was not a million that I put in my mind. That million was the Gila River. I gave that to the Gila. I just said, okay, let's take the 3B water and just forget fighting about it and just say, the Gila is off the table. But the 7.5 would be for the lower basin, other tributaries as well as main stem. Okay. So that's where the squeeze is.
Thanks for correcting my arithmetic.
Couple more minutes.
This may be a bit of a technical question, but how dependent is the system on return flows, and how will changes in use affect essentially the quantity of water available?
My lawn is return flows right now.
If you're looking at conversions from agricultural to municipal use, or converting, retiring agriculture along the main stem of the Colorado to provide more reliability for, CAP or MWD, that's a part of the engineering. It means you have to consider, from a Colorado perspective, you have to leave those return flows, traditional return flows, in the river for those who use it downstream. And that's just a part of the engineering effort that's needed to quantify those return flows and make sure that those return flows are left in the river. It's part of doing business. I see it's a cost of doing business.
It's a really important part of the economic negotiations, too, that we negotiate on dollars per acre foot of consumptive use reduced, forget the dollars per acre land fallowed, and so on. I mean, that's the way we really have to go.
There are also kind of important timing and locational issues that come up with return flow. Generally, when you fallow irrigation, you're moving the return flow up to the point of diversion and increasing it, accelerating the time of when it's in the river. And you have to worry about those things too. It's just not a quantitative analysis. It's location. It's also timing. And that requires a lot of kind of site-specific analysis. There is a lot of return flow dependency, and how it shifts is a very complicated question.
Bart Miller with Western Resource Advocates. A question I think might be addressed to any and all of the panelists. Implicit in your presentations is the notion that we may need to determine essential uses if we're going to do any kind of reallocation over time, whether that's an essential minimum flow, an essential type of agricultural, essential type of urban use. So for any of you, what do you see as essential uses, and is there already a system, or what systems will allow us to make those decisions? Is it just a market-based solution that the water flows uphill to money, or is it an opportunity for public policy to influence how we decide?
Well,
what's essential?
I would say that I would hope it's not a market decision, although it may end up being a market decision. In the case of the Colorado and looking at the water bank, I think the critical uses would hopefully be those that have the most economic and health effects on society in terms of human uses. I think we're also going to have to do with essential and critical environmental uses as well. But that's an issue we haven't tackled, and I think that may be an issue where there are differences within Colorado as to what's a critical use or an essential use in terms of what can be done out there. Again, I think we may end up on a water having the market address that in some way, but I don't think that will be the best outcome if that happens.
It certainly is one of those big, complicated questions that would be appropriately discussed in a basin-wide sort of dialogue. And using what Holly was talking about yesterday in terms of scenarios, sort of alternative futures, is what does it look like if we write off this sector, or if we emphasize this one, or how can we balance these differently? What does it look like? And if we can engage people who would be impacted by that in that discussion, at least our policymakers would be a little better informed about what the alternatives are and what people care about, what it would cost.
Last thoughts from the panel? Sarah's sort of wrapped us up quite nicely, but give you another 30 seconds. Well, let's thank the panel.